button. Very strange button, and I'm going to turn us over to Dr. David Fawcett. So welcome everybody, and type your questions in whenever you have them.
Thank you, Scott. I just a little plug that Crystal City documentary is still going strong. We had a screening in Austin that was very well received over the weekend, so that was kind of cool. I also want to just announce that the chemsex support group that we started elsewhere has now come to sex and relationship healing. So Tuesday evenings at 5 p.m. It's an open, not a webinar, but a meeting where we all see each other and talk about chemsex and support for recovery from chemsex. So I'm really excited about that. It's really happy to finally be here at Sex and Relationship Healing. So thank you. So anyway, I wanted to talk today, and these topics kind of come to me based on what's in the universe, in my universe anyway, and I'm dealing with clients right now who are having a really hard time surrendering to the addiction. And so I wanted to talk about just a little bit about the idea of surrender and what that means and what it doesn't mean and how it plays into our recovery. So first of all, surrender, I think most people think, especially most guys think, it's some kind of sign of weakness. That, okay, I'm like giving up, I'm somehow being less of a man or something, about surrendering to the idea that I have behaviors or drugs that are killing me. And it's that the addiction, is part of the way it works in the brain, just kind of takes over and builds this worldview that's very defended and where we don't really see the whole picture. So a lot of the first challenges in early recovery is to break through the denial so we can actually do that surrender. But the important thing, it's not a sign of weakness, but it's actually a sign of giving up the fight that we have against a perceived threat of whatever that is. And you know, without getting into a lot of psychological babble here, I want to, you know, we use the term ego, which is the kind of part of our brain that wants to protect itself from anything. That's the ego, when it gets involved, is really a key to keeping that defense alive, to keep denial alive, and to prohibiting us from surrendering very effectively. But what happens when we surrender? We start to feel what our addictions have wanted to keep us from feeling. You know, every week we talk about how addiction is a numbing process, a way to escape uncomfortable feelings, emotions, things, situations, whatever. It's a very effective way, in fact, of kind of stepping into this alternate universe, away from the emotional pain and just kind of in our own little world. And I think what that does is it prevents us from feeling feelings, feeling our sadness, our hurt, our fear, our abandonment, our feelings of being less than, all that stuff that nobody wants to feel. But I think addicts in early recovery have a backlog of that they haven't felt maybe their whole lives. And I think the addiction like fights to the death to keep us from feeling that. And that's the resistance people have. And they're not even really conscious of it, but that resistance to really feeling what they're afraid they might discover there. And so this ego, this lack of place of trust, place of fear, place of a desire to be in control, all of that kind of works against us in the surrender process from addiction. You know, when we think about addiction, also I mentioned not feeling feelings. It's all about avoidance. We avoid making a decision. We avoid doing the hard thing. We avoid telling somebody what we need to tell them. We avoid making changes in our lives for letting go of things that don't serve us anymore. You know, all those things get kind of a backlog that keeps us really locked into the addictive process. So really surrender, in my experience, in my own recovery and in 30 some years of clinical work, really surrender occurs at these kind of very specific moments. And we're not always open to it. I think there are moments when we become teachable, like those kind of multiple things that kind of all line up so there's a hole right through the middle of it where everything lines up. And usually what that's lined up from is at the end of an addictive cycle, we're in that remorse, we're feeling a lot of shame, we maybe have some terrible consequences, maybe we got an STI. I've had clients who seroconverted HIV, maybe their partners finally left them, maybe they lost their job, you know, all that stuff that will happen to an addict eventually. But when that stuff happens and they're at the end of that addictive cycle, there's a moment when they can like, oh my God. And every addict, by the way, at that moment says, I will never do that again. That was awful. I got to change this. And they start to feel better and suddenly they're back in the cycle. And so I think, but when they're in that remorse cycle, that's the time to really strike. The interventionists know this, that's when they really go with people, because that's when people are open to the idea. And so I think that's really, the timing really is everything. But then we have to really deal with some really basic questions. And the things I've had my clients express concern about is like, who am I going to be if I really let go of this addiction? And I had to identify with that. I had the same things. I was a young addict. I got into recovery in my 20s, but still I had a pretty healthy, robust addiction career. And I didn't know who I was without the safety net of that kind of numbing of my own addiction. I was afraid of who I would find in there. And part of mine was dealt with sort of some issues of my own, coming out as a gay man and so on. So it was all wrapped up. It's like, who the heck am I going to be? I know this addiction is killing me. I know it's causing me a lot of pain, but it's also kind of protecting me. It was keeping me locked in place. And that's, by the way, in my own addiction, that's very much the feeling I had. I felt I was just like locked down in this very dark place that I couldn't get out of. Another fear, what do I feel? You know, how I am going to be overwhelmed by my feelings. That's what an addict tells themselves. I have loads of grief. If I start crying, I will never stop. You know, I have so much fear. I don't know how I could even go out in the world without the benefit of something to help me numb or soothe when I come home. You know, what am I going to experience? How am I going to handle things? You know, all these questions are like really being thrust into the adult world without really some of the adult skills that people have. And most of all, perhaps, how will I manage those feelings? You know, and we know addicts in early recovery, our addiction overall is our primary coping mechanism. That's how we manage feelings. We numb them, we escape them, and we step away from them. But if we don't have that, what are we going to do? We're going to have to start feeling them. And that's a painful process. And when we talk about sex addicts, porn addicts, chemsex addicts, these are all intensity addictions that it's not just numbing, it's more kind of seeking sensation to distract us from some of this pain, the emotional pain. It still does the same thing. It still disconnects us from those feelings. This is a different strategy. So I think a lot of people start to figure out, okay, well, I'll surrender my porn, I'll surrender my sex addict, I'll surrender my meth or cocaine, but I need the intensity, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to start working 80 hours a week, or I might pick up a little gambling habit, or gee, I want to reward myself with that $800 pair of shoes that I'll charge, you know, things like, or on the opposite end, remember, those are all stimulating intensity addictions. People also can go toward numbing out. Maybe I start binge eating complex carbs and gain 30 pounds, or drop into other kinds of behaviors that are sort of numbing, TV, binge watching TV, for example. So there's all kinds of risks and perils, even when we start the surrender process, that we could just substitute some other behavior. And so I think that idea of surrender is just so critical. But I think that's truly face the fears in there and do it in a context of support and loving support. And that's what we do at Seeking Integrity. We provide that container where people can kind of take the risk of letting go and seeing what's in there and being walked through some of those perils. And then finally, I want to just mention we talked about surrender before, and I always like to talk about the paradox of the steps. But that paradox of the first step, which is, by the way, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol or whatever our addiction is, that our lives had become unmanageable. This is something I think that's a stumbling block for a lot of people when they read those words, you know, to admit that we're powerless and to actually do that surrender. But the irony and the paradox of that is if we actually do surrender, we gain our whole lives back. We gain the freedom to live our lives, to feel our feelings, to have healthy relationships. All that comes back to us. And I think that's the thing to kind of, that's the North Star to kind of hang on to if you're struggling with addiction, is these good things will happen. And you know, the big book talks about promises, and they do happen. I encourage people, if you're struggling with this, to go to a meeting and listen to people who've been around a while and see if the promises have worked for them. Talk to them. And it really does work. But that surrender is a tough one. It's something that's really difficult. You know, I think I'll mention one other program issue, and that's a Serenity Prayer, right? And I think that is all that helps us surrender, because we can decide, okay, I have trouble with this I can change, this I cannot change. What am I powerless over? And really sort of help us make decisions in that regard. But the bottom line is that I think we defer surrendering until we have no other choice. And sometimes that happens because our partners say enough. Sometimes we lose a job, sometimes our health is at stake, sometimes all of the above. But when those moments happen, those are kind of golden opportunities that we really have to jump on, because that's the doorway out. That's the off-ramp from our addiction. So thank you.
Thank you, David. I see somebody with a hand up. We don't do that in webinars. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature and we'll answer it there. I love this topic. Surrender was a difficult thing for me, David, as you know. I finally had somebody say, surrender to reality, and reality is you have an addiction that you can do something about. And that's kind of the step one paradox that you're talking about. We have to surrender to the fact that we have an addiction so that we can actually do something about it, which is steps 2 through 12, basically,
Right.
Of the 12 steps. And that's how I've always looked at surrender. And that has worked for me, because otherwise it's, when I first heard surrender, I thought it was weakness, like most of us do, because I'm a guy and I immediately think surrender, I'm weak, which meant I couldn't do anything about my addiction. And people were like, no, that's not what we mean at all.
Right.
So yeah, there's lots of paradoxes. One of the other paradoxes is particularly with intensity addictions, like we talk about here with porn and sex and chemsex and things like that, is we use the intensity to numb out and escape emotionally, which I think is a weird paradox. Can you talk a little bit about why more intensity equals more numbness?
Yeah, it is kind of a weird thing. What the research shows is that people that have experienced some trauma, and that's a lot of people with addicts, but some people who go on to develop kind of traumatic reactions, you would think that if somebody has been traumatized, they would kind of stay away from anxiety and the feelings that relate to risk and kind of excitement and that kind of stuff, because it generates this fight or flight response within. A lot of cortisol, you feel it, right? It feels like stress and anxiety. But what we actually find is that a lot of people that have that background actually become what we call sensation seekers. And by the way, there's also a high correlation between ADHD and intensity addiction, like 30%. And those are also sensation seekers. And so there's something about keeping very busy, just like the paradox of treating ADHD with amphetamine drugs, which actually speed up. But actually the paradox there is that the speeding up actually helps the person focus. And I think many intensity addicts, the intensity, the risk, the excitement, the kind of ever increasing cortisol and adrenaline and dopamine and all that, the chemical surge that goes on with that intensity actually helps people kind of focus on certain things, usually their addiction, but in a very focused way that kind of, much like our Zoom background, it kind of blurs everything else out, right? And so it kind of blurs all that so we don't feel it. And I think that is very common with the intensity addictions, for sure.
You mentioned that when we're asked to surrender, we think, who will I be if I let go of this? And how will I deal with my feelings? I came up with a couple other questions that I had. Will I ever have fun again? Yeah. And what will I do with all of this free time that has suddenly made its way to the surface? And I think those are kind of related with, how do I replace the intensity and the numbness? And will I have fun again? I mean, I had to ask myself, in retrospect, I asked myself, was I having fun in the addiction? And the answer was probably no. But what do you tell people when they ask, will I ever have fun again? And what am I supposed to do with this suddenly free 6 hours a day?
Right. And by the way, that the time that is freed up when we get into recovery is enormous. You think about all the energy and hours devoted to the addictive process. So yeah, that's a big consideration. And especially with intensity addicts who kind of abhor low stimulating situations like boredom or even relaxation, just sitting there. Because what happens when we sit, if we're an intensity addict, feelings start to bubble up, right? I may get a little uncomfortable may have a feeling of being sad or fearful or even happy. Any feeling can be kind of threatening a little bit. And so we have to really learn how to usefully use that time. A lot of our discharge planning at Seeking Integrity involves scheduling. And what are we going to do with that schedule? And how are we going to do that? But in terms of the fun, and I agree with you, I think I did a postdoctoral internship out in Seattle, and they, like many, not all of them were recovering addicts, but it became profoundly clear to them. I was like, I didn't know how to have fun. I didn't know how to relax. And I was in recovery then too, but they were giving me therapeutic assignments to go like have fun, like like my inner child should have fun, right? Because I didn't know how to do it. And I think, so I think learning how to relax, learning how to engage ourselves for people in the sex addiction world, those outer circle behaviors that are also, by the way, sources of dopamine as well, but to really start to focus on those. And there's a gift. And over time, basically, I've rediscovered, interests and hobbies. I revived stuff that had fallen away due to my addiction. But I've also, when we're present in our lives, when we're feeling stuff, when we're engaged with other people, the world starts to flow. And I think that flow is really essential for engagement in life. And that includes fun things, and includes, music and play and all kinds of stuff that I think for the first time as an adult, I honestly had to learn how to do. But that's a skill that we really have to focus on. And I really appreciate you bringing it up, because it's a big threat for people. It's like, what am I going to do with this? The other one, by the way, is, will I ever have decent sex again, right? Not that the sex and sex addiction is very great at the end, typically, but I think a lot, yeah, exactly. But a lot of the chemsex guys particularly said, I've had clients say to me directly when I'm asking them to give up meth and give up sex for a while, just to kind of break that connection, they're saying, you're dooming me to a life of vanilla, boring, or no sex. This is my future, right? Which is not true, but that's kind of the fear. The other thing, and I don't want to talk too long, but the with the intensity addictions, our brain goes through this adaptation to get used to all the stimulation it's dealing with all the time. And when we suddenly get in recovery and turn off that stimulation, the brain has already adapted to being used to it. And so there's a couple months of adaptation when the brain has to kind of recycle itself back to a normal level of existence. And in that time, there's this thing called anhedonia, which is this literally the inability to experience pleasure. Our brain, when we first get into recovery from sex or porn, or chemsex addiction particularly, our brain has adapted to this really high intensity, high excitement, everything, crises, drama, all this stuff coming at it. And suddenly life gets quiet. And with that, there's it's called a dopamine downregulation. But what that does, it means that our brain has adapted and we are not able to experience the pleasure of normal life that we will in a couple months. But for a while, everything's going to be blah. Our food doesn't taste as good. The colors aren't as pretty. Our dog doesn't love us as unconditionally as before, whatever. But everything's kind of blah. But that's really important to people to understand that's temporary. That does change.
Yeah. And just to this end, you mentioned the outer circle earlier. I actually think one of the more brilliant things that the sexual recovery programs did was they came up with a circle plan or a boundary plan with the inner circle or inner boundary, which is the bottom line behaviors, and then the middle circle boundary, which is slippery stuff, and then the outer circle, which is all the healthy stuff we can do instead. That's fun, our goals for life, having fun with friends, having fun with our partner, rebuilding intimacy, pursuing a new career, having a pet, taking care of the house, all this stuff that we can do. And I actually use the circle plans with my non-sex addict sponsees or people I'm working with, because I think it's so brilliant. And I carried my circle plan with me. A lot of you have heard me say this for a couple of years, little tiny printed out version of my circle plan. This was before we had these things. So you actually had to use your dot matrix printer and print something out in 6-point type.
And Scott, how old are you? I'm older than you too. I handwritten mine. So, okay.
I may have not been using a dot matrix printer at this point, but I might have,
I did.
There may have been one in the house still.
Yeah.
But I carried it with me, not because I couldn't figure out what I wasn't supposed to do. I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do. It was
exactly,
how am I going to have fun? How am I going to fill the hours? And even today, my biggest trigger is boredom. I do not do well bored. So I still just go straight to my outer circle.
And if I may say one thing about that, I think, so when I talk with clients about some of their outer circle behaviors, so maybe it's hiking, okay, which is great. Exercise is always good it helps the brain too. But I encourage them, well, don't go hiking by yourself, ask a friend, right? So I think the more we can connect, that healing power of connection, if we can do stuff together, that just amplifies the benefits of it tremendously, I think. We do stuff as a group. So I always encourage clients to think in those terms, okay, yeah, that activity is great, but how could you involve it with somebody else? It'd be a lot more fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, guys will always, they'll do their circle plan and their outer circle is like nothing but going to meetings and therapy. I'm like, okay, well, that's good for a while, but let's put some fun stuff in there. So they come up with a whole bunch of stuff that they only have to do by themselves. And I'm like,
Right,
okay,
exactly.
well, that's good. Now let's bring some other people into the
right, exactly.
because that's the stuff that really keeps us sober. And a lot of us arrive with no friends and are, semi-estranged, and it's very hard to actually do things with other people. And we can reach out into that. We've got it in the comment, include the wife. Yes, include your wife. Yes, include your kids. But also, include other people, meet people in 12-step recovery, meet people in our drop-in groups. And if they live in your area, God, go to coffee together. And go on hikes together, go to ball games together, walk your dogs together. There's a big batch of people in recovery here who meet at the dog park every morning at like 6 a.m. All their dogs. And that's their thing for like an hour, hour and a half. They have coffee, it starts. So anyway, okay, Q&A. Could you explain, and I asked for an example, this which is in the chat, just I'll read it to you. Could you explain the I'm going to show you being defiant behaviors that only hurt and backfire on the addict? Is there hope that this can change? And I asked for an example. And the example I got was acting out when things are going good. I want to see how far I can go. So pushing the limits when things are going good, or acting out when I've got this, I'm good to go. I'll show you, I can go back and do X, Y, and Z, but not P, E, and Q or whatever. So,
right.
Why do we do that? And is there hope to change it?
Right. Great question. And I want to actually talk about not just the behaviors, but when I hear those words, because I think oftentimes, and that happens a lot at Seeking Integrity, or in the early days of a client stay, is like, I'm going to, I hear them when they're talking to their wives, I will show you, I can do this. I'm going to do this. But it's, we also, draw a distinction between an apology and amends. That's a parallel thing here. An apology is words, right? It's like words are cheap. How many times has an addict apologized? An amends is a behavioral change. It's actually showing that you can do something. It's doing something different, not saying that you're going to do something different. So I think in that sense, talk is cheap, right? If we're talking about simply the words and the phrase. So anytime I hear somebody, I'm going to show you, or I'm going to do this, I'm really committed to this. Yeah, okay. Let's see how you do. Let's see some behavior change. But when we actually there's that defiance piece when it's like, and I've had other colleagues, not here, but in the past, who would kind of use this sometimes with clients, where a client was very resistant. It's like, and I don't believe this is a good therapeutic process, or it's like, well, I bet you can't. It's like, that's really kind of this negative reinforcement thing, where then the person says, well, I'll show you, but it's kind of a wrong way to approach it. I think it's that same defiant energy that we see sometimes in marriages or in partnerships, where the addict is kind of acting out and in a way that is really pushing the limit like that, without really making true behavior change. So I think what I think everybody wants to see in recovery is just doing it without kind of announcing that you're doing it, or taking credit for doing it, or just kind of just showing up, and suddenly it's a month or 2 or 3 months down the road, and you can look back and you've done it without having to point to it or point it out or see how good it is or all that stuff. I think just kind of doing your thing in recovery is probably the better way to go, as opposed to announcing it or pronouncing it or doing it with some kind of energy to push back at something. I think that's a key.
Yeah, I have thoughts on this, but I want to go back to something. I just want to make sure, I want to clarify and make sure I got this right, because we've never talked about this before. I think you said that reverse psychology and things like negative reinforcement are not great therapeutic tools. I just want to make sure.
That's my feeling, right? And then starting at the really extremes of like conversion therapy for gay men, right? So teaching them sending them to a camp to get straight. That's not only illegal in many places, it's considered unethical by every professional board. And less outrageous than that is sometimes these dynamics I see with people, sponsors or therapists, kind of encouraging somebody by appealing to their defiance. And I think building on that defiance is not necessarily a healthy energy to move into recovery, especially if we're talking something about surrender. There's nothing surrendering about taking on a challenge because you're going to beat this, you're going to show them, and it's just, I think it's the wrong approach. So I personally don't approve of that approach myself.
Yeah, and I think there are studies that show things like, shock therapy as like a negative reinforcement tool. It lasts for about, while it's happening, and then as soon as the shocks are removed, the negative reinforcement, it loses all value. And people
Yeah, it's just I wouldn't do that for my dog, and I wouldn't do that for my clients. It's just not a good way to do things, I think, for behavior change.
Yeah, so just some clarity. This question was about, being defiant against the wife. I'll show you, I had some thoughts. Is there hope that this can change? Sure there is, but it's really up to you. If I had a sponsor who was doing this, I would say, okay, write down all the reasons that you have for justifying this behavior every time you do it, and then we would examine those reasons. And, this is something that was done with me. And every time I ever had to read my list of denial out loud, I realized I was crazy. And that I was really not in, it was not my best thinking that was getting me into my slips and relapses. So that's one. Number two, add some roadblocks. If you know you're prone to this, put some roadblocks in.
Great idea.
Get Net Nanny on all your devices. Make sure you check in with a sponsor or a fellow in recovery like 3 times a day if you have to, or 3 different people if you don't want to bother with one person. 3, put some roadblocks in there, and take, dedicate some time each day to your outer circle, whether it's a specific recovery activity or something fun, and take it one day at a time or 1 hour at a time. Sometimes it's like, well, I'm just not going to act out this hour. I know I want to, and I've got 100 good reasons why, and most of them are going to be blaming your wife or whatever it is, but just say, but not this hour. Ask me again in an hour. And usually the desire goes away during that time. So
I might say one more thing if I can, Scott, about that kind of, there's that attitude of defiance, which is a very similar, I guess, flavor to anger. And I think anytime I see anger, defiance, that kind of stuff, I always ask like what's underneath it, because those are emotions and behaviors that cover something underneath. And we talked tonight about the surrender and how our addictions keep stuff kind of at bay. And I think what's underneath that, and I'd encourage people, if you're feeling anger, if you're feeling defiant, drop underneath it and see what feeling is there. Because typically it's fear, it's hurt, it's sadness, it's some basic primary feeling that's down underneath that. I think understanding that is really helpful to guide the solution for that.
Yeah, excellent point. It used to be we'd have these little charts with like smiley faces and like emojis before we had emojis, and they would be labeled, and you would point to them and say, I'm feeling this and this. What we have now are feelings wheels, which are kind of fabulous because they give you layers. So if you're feeling angry, it'll break off and you can actually see what might be under your anger if you have trouble identifying emotions and feelings. Like I still do to a certain extent, and horribly did in my first few years of recovery. So Google feelings wheel, and I think they're pretty fabulous.
They sure are.
So hello, Dr. Fawcett. My betrayed partner comes from a traditional family and is not interested in therapy. This is the betrayed partner who's not interested in therapy, but is still triggered a year later and reminds me of the betrayal, of course. I'm sober for a year and doing better, but her underlying trauma, unresolved, I assume, still bothers me. She has not talked about this trauma to family or friends. Should I keep trying to convince her to go to therapy, or is it better to not get involved and focus on myself? That's a really good question.
Yeah, great question. And by the way, kudos to you for you're sober and struggling with other dynamics. So I think your wife or your partner is going to really have to address that trauma if she wants to kind of move past the betrayal and the wounds and the hurt, right? She's really sitting in her pain. We're talking tonight about surrender, and in a way, she's as locked up as an addict might be in terms of not surrendering to that process of healing the trauma. And I'm sure the same questions we asked the day tonight, what am I going to feel? How am I going to handle that? What's going to happen to me? What's in there? I'm sure she's thinking all that stuff too. And so I think maybe to gently talk about it. I hope you guys are doing check-ins and talk about it. And I think in that kind of situation, the best you can do is express your feelings about the situation. That her resistance to therapy is causing you a lot of concern for her and for yourself and pain. And at that point, at some point, you have to turn it over. You have to surrender to that too. She'll do what she does. But I think in this kind of situation, when somebody's really not moving because of fear and emotional, lockdown, if you will, pushing them, arguing with them, cajoling them, all that, berating them or whatever people do, it doesn't work. It just makes it worse. So I think the best you can do is really share your feelings, share your concern for her, and also, by the way, model behavior, which it sounds like you're doing in terms of healing through therapy. So I think that's the best I would suggest. And if there's other people in her orbit that might also be influential in helping her understand that, I would maybe engage them as well.
Normally we get the flip side of this question. It's the betrayed partner who's asking, about the addict who's not making any progress. And the betrayed partner wants to know, how hard should I push, things like this. And the answer is exactly the same. It's express your feelings. When you do this, I feel this, and it makes me feel unsafe, and it's hard for me to be intimate with you. But ultimately, the addict's decision to get sober or not is the addict's, and we can't get well for someone else, and no matter how much we want to, and that kind of sucks because we love these people, whether we're the betrayed partner or the addict. We love our partner. That's why we're with them, and we want them to feel better and to be happier and to feel more connected. We want all the things for them that we would want for ourselves. And if they're resistant, whether, the partner, whether it's a betrayed partner or an addict, when people are resistant to that, to getting help for themselves that it's obvious to us they need, it's really painful. One of the things you should say is, this is really painful for me because I know you're suffering.
Right.
I can see it.
And by the way, Scott sort of talked about this, I guess we'd call it a STEM sentence that's really useful in these situations where when we are concerned about somebody else's behavior and what they're doing, the best way to convey that is to relate how you're feeling to what the behavior is. So, and that's really almost as far as we can go. So, when you don't seek therapy, when you're not getting better, when you're not getting the support you need, it makes me concerned, it makes me hurt, it makes me scared, that kind of thing. You're relating your feelings to her, and it's not defensive, it's not argumentative, it's just expressing how you're feeling and why. And I think that carries great power because people have a hard time pushing back against that, defending that, because it's just kind of a fact. And so I would try to use that kind of expression.
And when betrayed partners are resistant to getting help, it's usually, I'm not the one with the problem. I didn't cheat. I didn't screw up our relationship. I didn't lie and manipulate and gaslight. And my response to betrayed partners is, you're right, you didn't.
Right.
And you don't need the same help that the addict needs, but maybe you deserve to get some help. Maybe you deserve to get some support. You just got hit by a Mack truck. You deserve to go to the hospital and get some triage for the pain you're feeling.
Right. For still being triggered a year later. That's no way to live.
Particularly when it's still going on for a year later, and the addict here says he's sober. I assume it's he. I'm being biased here, but the addict is a year, says that he or she is a year sober. I have to believe that. So, normally that's when betrayed partners really start to come around and trust starts to really re-enter the relationship, anywhere from 6 to 18 months, depending on, the people and the quality of the rigorous honesty, etc. So, is it necessary for addiction to have negative impact on your life for it to be a disorder? How do we know if a behavior is problematic early on instead of waiting until it hurts us? Is there a list of possible behaviors we can always be cautious of? Another great question.
Yeah, great question. I think I remember I mentioned earlier tonight, I got sober in my 20s and thinking I'm way too young to get sober. I don't need to get sober. This isn't that bad. And I remember my first sponsor telling me, all you have to know is that you're on an elevator going down and you can get off at the 20th floor or the 10th floor or the basement. And I don't know what floor you're on now, but it's only going to go down and get worse. And I think, that kind of clicked for me. I realized, oh my God, yeah, there are a few things I haven't lost, but I really believed that I eventually would. And so I think really understanding that process. But I don't think, I can't think of behaviors per se, specific behaviors. There are many that could be problematic, but I think we look at certain things with addiction where if we attempt to control the behavior and we repeatedly have trouble controlling that behavior, if those behaviors are causing us to miss major events in our lives or disrupt kind of normal a sense of purpose and so on. So there's some basic kind of standard criteria for addiction that I think would be useful to look at and kind of as a template and hold up to your life and see where do you fit in that. Because most of us early on, before we ever have a dream that we might have a problem and this might lead to something far worse, we're noticing that, well, yeah, I said I would only do this, but then I did it. So maybe I'll redraw the line in the sand and I'll, and then we cross that line and just, we start to notice these patterns of kind of violating our intentions, not being able to keep promises to ourselves, not being able to keep promises to others or commitments because our addiction starts to get in the way. So I think those things are the warning signs rather than the specific behaviors, in my opinion. Scott, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, if you look in the DSM, there are 11 criteria for addiction, any 2 of which is enough to diagnose it. Most addiction therapists, including us here at Seeking Integrity, we go by 3 basic criteria: preoccupation to the point of obsession, loss of control over use, which is generally evidenced by failed attempts to quit or cut back. I tried to quit. I quit drinking 1,000 times.
Right.
Never for more than about 48 hours, but I quit drinking a lot and I quit using porn a lot. So failed attempts to quit is number 2. And number 3 is directly related negative consequences and or indirectly related negative consequences. Right. Can be things like depression and anxiety, which I was manifesting long before there were more obvious consequences related to my addiction. And I popped into the chat feature. There's an article on signs of addiction written for betrayed partners of sex addicts. And Dr. Rob and I put this together. Deceitfulness. Addicts are excellent liars. We fib, we make excuses, and you will catch us eventually. So even before consequences, deceitfulness. Now, little kid, 3-year-old, did you eat the cookie? No. They're pretty deceitful too. So, none of these alone signal addiction, but all of these together, you probably have a problem. Gaslighting, we're pressuring you to believe our lies. Mood swings. Addicts can seem really happy and connected with you 1 minute and then disconnected and irritable the next minute. Typical addict trait. Physical isolation. If we're hiding from you, we're trying to keep something secret. It may be sex addiction, it may be drug addiction, drinking, whatever. Emotional withdrawal. Addicts are notoriously non-intimate with other people. We're rarely vulnerable. We never share about our feelings. We never share about our problems. We'd rather eat a plate of worms. We're struggling at work, we're struggling in school. If the house is falling apart, if the bills aren't paid, all of that stuff. Signs of a problem. And declining physical health and emotional health, depression, stress, anxiety, all of this stuff. These are all massive signs that something is wrong. It could be an addiction. So if you see signs like that, it's worth exploring with the other person. And the way to bring it up is, I noticed this. Can you tell me what's going on? I noticed this. Can you tell me, just don't be accusatory. Anytime you're intervening, David, do you have thoughts on how to properly intervene when you think there might be a problem?
Yeah, I think we mentioned before, kind of direct confrontation usually throws up all the nuclear defenses, right? The iron shield goes up and people can't get through. But I think that kind of concerned, non-accusatory, but noticing behavior, sort of, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm feeling, this, I'm concerned about it. I think that kind of expression, and even then, probably the addict is going to say, no, it's fine, it's fine. But I think enough of that starts to convey the message that this person, first of all, maybe onto me, but also is maybe a safe person to talk about this with. And in my own case, that was a couple of people that I really cared about who persisted in that kind of approach, saying, look, we're noticing this, we're seeing that, I'm really concerned. And eventually it got through. So I think in any way that the person, to make it accessible to them. And by the way, I think that's true not just for spouses, it could be true for employers or for friends or other, that same kind of dynamic of noticing and speaking up. I think sometimes we're too polite with people and we could really save a life or save a lot of pain and hardship by intervening earlier on somebody. We let people slide. And I think with an addict, they will take every inch of that and take it. So I think if we can gently confront, firmly confront too, I think that's really the best approach.
Yeah, and often I think the spouse is the last person to know, like particularly when there's cheating, often everybody in the neighborhood knows before the spouse finds out. And I think it's because we want to believe our partner. If I'm married to you, I love you and I want to believe what you tell me. I want to believe you. And addicts will really take advantage of that. Everybody knows, and then the spouse finds out. It's really awful for the spouse. I love this next question. And this is one of the best questions we've ever gotten, I think. How do you explain to the addict who only knows intensity what they are missing in intimacy?
Wow.
That's a heck of a question, isn't it? There's a lot.
Yeah, just what, 12 little words or something. Yeah, okay. So I talked earlier about intensity and how sex addicts and porn addicts and sex addicts, gamblers, kleptomaniacs, work addicts, there's a bunch of intensity addictions. All those really stoke up a certain neurochemical kind of cocktail inside of cortisol and adrenaline and dopamine. It's basically fight or flight. That's the sensation. And that's what people are going for. It's the intensity, it's like revved up. And unfortunately, that extended state of that fight or flight can go on a long time with intensity addicts because they're constantly in that state. It's very unhealthy. But a lot of people, because sex is often part of this intensity addiction, a lot of people confuse that intensity for intimacy. And we at Seeking Integrity define every sex addict as an intimacy disorder, meaning every person, literally, we've ever seen, every person that most addicts have ever treated have what's called an intimacy disorder, meaning that from an early age, most of us were taught or learned that certain relationships could be really kind of tricky or dangerous. And that usually starts with caregiver relationships. If we have, for example, a parent who is kind of disconnected and not really concerned with us, there may be some abandonment issues, or there may be issues that, I can't trust that they'll be there when I really need them. This is, by the way, the classic sex addict thing, because, okay, well, if I can't count on anybody else to meet my needs, I'll meet them myself, right? And that's kind of the underlying wiring of the software in the sex addict brain is like, well, I need to do this myself because nobody else is going to do it for me. And so early on, we learn these lessons of kind of taking care of ourselves and disconnecting and not trusting and not being vulnerable, because being vulnerable in many cases hurts. We may have been hit or abused or ignored or abandoned or, and so kids, and it's not a conscious process, but kids draw conclusions, and those conclusions become what we call attachment wounds. And there's a lot of work, a lot of our clients work with a guy named Troy Love, who does amazing work with attachment wounds. But these result in core beliefs, these things like I can't trust anybody, I have to meet my own needs, I'm not safe to share my feelings, that kind of stuff. So we grow up, we don't know how to kind of relate to people in a healthy way. And very often sex addiction kind of substitutes that intensity. We're involved with a lot of people, sometimes thousands of people. And I've talked to many sex addicts and chemsex addicts who, I remember a client I had who had, I don't know, 10,000 partners conservatively, who he said he was the loneliest person in the world. He felt like there was nobody out there for him. It was all empty, meaningless kind of encounters. And what he was really looking for was the intimacy. But his strategy was to kind of try to find it through the intensity. And that's a huge issue because in recovery, those are two totally different strategies. The intensity is not working. The intensity has to kind of drop down in recovery by default. And so the addict really, I believe, for the first time, has to learn what are the building blocks of intimacy? How does it even work? What does that mean? And one of the things we talk about consciously with our groups of Seeking Integrity, with these guys that come together, strangers when they arrive, and after the end of 2 or 3 weeks, they probably know more about each other than anybody else on earth because they've been sharing, and everybody comes in. I'm going to take some stuff to my grave. You'll never find out. And, with some encouragement, they leave it because all that stuff carries shame. But my point is that by sharing, and there's no sex going on, obviously, but by these group of men sharing their feelings in a group, and we create this safe container where they feel safe enough to talk about that, that's the building blocks of intimacy. That's where they start to say how they're feeling. That's how they start to receive feedback from other people. That's how they start to learn these interactions. And that's really the foundation of intimacy. That's what spouses want, obviously. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what's going on inside. That's so hard for an addict. And I think part of recovery, and the great thing about treatment, is that there's a place where they can learn how to do that. And it's the building blocks of it. And I think beyond that, there's a whole bunch of skills. I'm a sex therapist to deal with building that intimacy, building those connections in healthy ways. But my point, I guess, the bottom line is that addicts don't know how to do that. And I'll give a story. When I was creating my book, Lust, Men, and Meth, the subtitle was something like Reclaiming Healthy Sex and Intimacy. And I realized addicts, they're not reclaiming anything. They didn't know how to do it in the first place. And so I think that this is a major struggle. This is like the graduate school of sex addiction recovery. We get the basics, we learn how to stay sober, we learn how to, deal with our circles and build those outer circle behaviors and start to repair. And we don't go to disclosures with our spouses. But at some point we have to learn, with the next step is really developing those intimacy skills. And that's a specialized skill that I think requires some therapeutic support for a lot of people. But and I'm sorry to ramble. I think I'm rambling now. But that this idea of intensity versus intimacy is key. And I think it's an assumption that many people have when they first start recovery, that the intensity is the way to find intimacy. It's just not. And so explain that gently. I think working with a couples therapist or a sex therapist who can start to work on these issues specifically is going to be really important.
Yeah, and I just want to make the point that intimacy, most sex addicts, I use the word intimacy and they think I'm talking about sex. And I'm not necessarily. There is sexual intimacy, but there's also emotional intimacy and non-sexual physical intimacy, just holding hands or cuddling or just looking into each other's eyes and talking and sharing honestly. And this scares the hell out of sex addicts. And all addicts. I mean, we are afraid of other people because other people can hurt us. Other people can reject us. Other people can say no. They can make fun of us. When we are vulnerable and show our needs, we've learned early in life, as David said, that we may get rejected. We may get hurt, and that happens often enough, and we stop trying. And we use intensity as a replacement, but also as a way to avoid. Porn never says no. Meth never says no.
Porn never rejects either,
yeah,
right? It's all totally, no. We're in control. It's all safe.
Yeah, it's safer. Now, we are missing, can you talk a little bit about the neurochemicals? With intensity, we get dopamine and adrenaline. With intimate sexuality, what do we get?
Right. So yeah, it's a whole different profile. Remember that the intensity stuff really looks like fight or flight. Intimacy is a whole different set of neurochemicals, GABA and all these hormones, including oxytocin, which is the love hormone, the bonding hormone. It's the hormone that surges when a woman gives birth and by the way, that when the husband is there as well, the husband, there's not even a physical connection, but the husband also has oxytocin. These are bonding agents. This is what happens with limerence, that early phase of falling in love, when you're kind of preoccupied to the point of stalking somebody because you're so obsessed with them. And people like that. And by the way, romance addicts, that's what they're addicted to, that the neurochemistry of limerence. It feels good. It's exciting to be obsessed with somebody and about the possibilities and what might happen. And after about 2 or 3 months, our brains readjust. And a lot of people think, oh, I'm falling out of love, and they go on for someone else for that early thing. But that moment when the chemicals start to kind of balance again, that's when we can start to develop intimacy skills. That's when, instead of moving on to somebody else and falling in love again for another 3-month relationship, that's when we have the opportunity to take this deeper, to go forward, to kind of go into the unknown for some people and really explore being vulnerable. And by the way, there are physical exercises to help this with couples. I talk about this a lot, but Masters and Johnson, there's an exercise called Sensate Focus, which is all about an intimacy communication exercise for couples that may end up sexually, but it doesn't start out that way. It's a non-sexual way to sort of start to learn each other through physical touch. And so I think there's different ways of kind of rewiring the brain for this need from intensity to more appealing to other avenues, letting our bodies respond, for example, as opposed to kind of charging up a hot enough fantasy in our brain to make it work, which is, and you know, in sobriety, the fantasies and the intensity is never going to match what it was in the addiction. And so I think we can't try to, I remember I told the clients this yesterday, I had a client who wanted meth sex without the meth. It's like, well, no, it doesn't work that way, you know? So I think to really practice it, but I would just want to underline what Scott said, intimacy scares the hell out of addicts. And I think to really understand that and to really work with that is important.
Now, that said, I mean, sex is never going to have that intensity, but it can be better than ever.
Oh my God.
Most sex addicts, when I really push them, did you enjoy the sex? No. You know, 99 times out of 100, no. Maybe once in a while it was kind of hot, but the sex wasn't very good. So this connected sex that you can have in your relationship as part of, in your recovery, as part of your relationship, ends up being the best sex that you've ever had. It's really worth the work that it takes to develop sexual intimacy. And your relationship can be better too. Most sex addicts who stay together with their partner and develop relationship trust, they're more vulnerable than they ever were. So they're more emotionally intimate with their partner than ever. And the relationship is better because of that. It's beyond their wildest dreams. Sex addicts, we don't think we can have that great, perfect, wonderful, tell each other everything relationship, but we can.
Right. Well, it's scary as hell, right?
Yes.
But I think, yeah, just the other thing I would encourage people to go to meetings where there's some long-term recovery and talk to people who've been in this, you know, for 2 or 3 years and see what it's like for them. And I think that can be very inspirational, because you'll talk to people that are experiencing what Scott just said, where things have improved in ways that are infinitely superior to the kind of the cheap thrills, if you will, of intensity of sex addiction. It's a totally different
thrills
ballgame.
is exactly what it is with sex addiction. It's cheap thrills. It's a roller coaster ride or whatever.
Right.
You know, it's over in 2 minutes, and you know we're on to the next ride.
Right.
And that's a little too graphic. Sorry. Is OCD common among addicts? Do people get addicted to avoid OCD thoughts, but find that addiction increases their OCD instead? Can you first explain what OCD is?
Yeah, so OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. It's a kind of anxiety disorder. And it has a kind of a range where it can be quite disturbing for somebody. I remember I had a client staring at me once in my office, and I realized, what are you looking at? Because he was looking past me. He was looking at my bookshelf behind my chair, and it made him very distressed that my titles weren't in alphabetical order, and that's all he could focus on. And that's really bad OCD, right? But in other times it's just more kind of obsessive thinking about stuff, and in many ways the addict mirrors OCD, because we talked about the obsessive piece as one of those inherent qualities of addiction. But I don't know the numbers offhand, but it's high. probably 20–30% co-occurring OCD and anxiety disorders with sex addiction. And so I think the two kind of reinforce each other and they kind of fuse in certain ways, but the addiction itself has those obsessive qualities. But I think sometimes when I've seen an OCD issue followed by an addiction, it's usually the person is in such distress about needing everything in order in their life that they're kind of self-medicating with certain kinds of behaviors to avoid, distract, and so on. The unfortunate part about somebody suffering like that is that there's really good treatments for OCD, both cognitive behavioral therapy and there's certain medications. Some of the SSRI antidepressants are really good for OCD. So there's methods to control it, but I think when it occurs in the same person, co-occurs, I think it really does escalate the addictive behavior for sure. And I think in certain cases it actually can be the root of some of those behaviors because the distress it causes can be so overwhelming. And people laugh about OCD or they make jokes about themselves being OCD. For people that really have OCD, it's an incredibly painful experience because everything is kind of disruptive and causes anxiety. So I think it's important to kind of have a lot of empathy there, but and also to always point out that there's good treatment.
Yeah, I mean, OCD is one of the primary differences between obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a compulsivity, and addiction, which is also a compulsive behavior, is addiction is usually a pleasurable. There's some element of pleasure in the behavior.
Right.
Drinking makes us feel good, or sex makes us, or what. OCD is counting the ceiling tiles, or compulsive hand washing, or just on your knees.
And repetition for fear that you have to do, and starting over. It's horrible.
Yeah, and it's really disruptive and hideous. I think maybe the underlying issues probably might come from the same place, a need to escape and control, but the manifestation is in that respect quite different. But equally destructive. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. We will be back next Wednesday, same time, same place. Bring your questions and we hope to see you. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just everybody hang in there. And if you're struggling with surrender, remember there's hope on the other side of that.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Scott. Take care. Bye.